So, we've learned about Henry VIII and all of the unlucky ladies who fell into a marriage with him, but what about the children they created? 3 of them, to be exact. We had Mary I, Bloody Mary, we had Elizabeth I, and then finally his pride and joy, Edward VI. Let's just say some reigned for longer than others. Join me as we delve into sickly sons, boundless beheadings, and maybe the original master of medieval Photoshop. Starting off with Henry VIII's only son, his pride and joy, Edward VI. As we know, Henry VIII desperately wanted a son so that he could have somebody to take over the throne once he was dead. Jane Seymour gave him this with the birth of Edward on the 12th of October 1537. Unfortunately, Jane died just 12 days after the birth of Edward, and this could have been seen as foreshadowing for the rest of Edward's life. So fast forward about 10 years to the 28th of January 1547. King Henry died. This meant it was Edward's turn to take the throne. But I know what you're thinking.
Wait, so if Edward was born in 1537 and Henry died at the start of 1547, surely that would have made him, like, incredibly young to become king.
Well, yes, he was just 9 years old when he was crowned king. That makes him the youngest monarch in English history, and that is a record that still stands today. As I'm sure you can expect, this is far too young to be a king. So they had somebody called a Lord Protector to rule on his behalf. They would rule the country until he was old enough to lead himself. The first Lord Protector of England was Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour. He was then overthrown by somebody called John Dudley. Both of these men continued to make changes to the Church of England, just as Henry VIII had before. However, they made it a bit more bland. Well, more bland, but also more radical. Churches were stripped of their colours and their stained glass windows and made a lot more plain. They also made a Book of Common Prayer in English rather than Latin. This meant that a lot more people could understand the services that they were attending. Whilst this was all happening, Edward was growing older, but also more frail. Towards the end of 1553, Edward and his council started creating plans for what would happen to the crown and who would become king or queen after he eventually died. Logically, the crown would go to Mary I, his older half-sister and the oldest child of Henry VIII. But, and I'm so sorry to have to say this, but she was a Catholic. And Edward, as well as his Lord Protectors, they'd done a lot to get rid of this whole Catholic thing and move towards a Protestant religion. So they did not want to go back. This is an important part of the story, so keep that in mind for later. So to avoid the comeback of the Catholics, Edward named his heir as Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, because she was a Protestant too. Edward died on July the 6th, 1553, at the tender age of just 15 years old. It is thought that he died of tuberculosis, which is a disease that affects the lungs and breathing. However, it's not quite the end of Edward's story and legacy. Lady Jane Grey was next in line because, as I said, Edward named her as his Protestant heir. She was crowned queen on the 10th of July 1553. This meant a new era for the British crown, away from the Tudor name. This lasted for the incredibly long time of... Hold on, that can't be right. 9 days? No, who wrote this? 9 days, that's it. Let's just say, the English people were not too happy with the crown going to Lady Jane Grey, mainly because she was not of Tudor blood, and there was actually quite a lot of support for the Catholic faith. But do you know who is popular with them? Edward's half-sister, Mary I. I told you to remember her. Within 9 days of Lady Jane Grey becoming queen, Mary I had assembled an army with the sole purpose of getting that crown on her head. As you can find out in the next video, it is safe to say that she succeeded. However, again, that is a story for the next video. So back to Edward. Overall, he will be more remembered for what people did on his behalf rather than what he did. A devoted Protestant from his father's teachings, his main goal was just to continue the reform that his father had started towards his way of thinking and away from the Catholic way of thinking. But this progress that the sickly boy had so desperately wanted would be wiped out by the person he wanted nowhere near that crown. The person who was part of his own blood. So, join me next time as we look at the Protestant scorching eldest daughter of the third generation of royal Tudors, Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary.